Welcome to Heard on West Exec, the podcast about everything you need to know about working in the executive branch. Brought to you by the American Cornerstone Institute Executive Branch for America program. I'm Evelyn Lim, Vice President of Policy and Programs at the American Cornerstone Institute, and I'm so excited to have our distinguished guest, Ambassador Rick Grenell, joining us on the show. Welcome, Ambassador. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've had a very distinguished career in the executive branch, serving at the highest levels of public service in our government. Tell me about your career path.
My career path? Well, I was always interested in politics and the media and did a variety of political jobs. I think a turning point for me was in 2001. I became the spokesman at the UN for the U.S. mission to the UN. So I worked for 4 different U.S. ambassadors to the UN. I saw a lot of different style. I saw wars. It's a multilateral institution of 193 countries. So I saw a lot of different styles of diplomacy, what works, what doesn't work. And then after 8 years of working there and at the State Department, I joined in on the Trump campaign in 2016 and worked really hard for Donald Trump. I believed that President Trump at the time was somebody who learned the lessons of the Iraq War and of Afghanistan and the problems of trying to take democracy, our type of democracy, and move it into other countries without kind of a flavor in that country. We were exporting our style of diplomacy of democracy, and it really wasn't working. And we had all sorts of problems, and I think very few people were able to see it and adjust. And Donald Trump was one of those people, and taking on the system. So I really, I think, was moving in that same direction at the same time Donald Trump was on the rise, and I joined the campaign, and from there. I think it was an incredible ride. President Trump won in 2016, as everyone knows. And then I became U.S. Ambassador to Germany. And then he asked me to be acting director of national intelligence for a short period of time while they found a DNI, a permanent DNI. And I did that for 3 or 4 months under the condition that they would find somebody else. It really wasn't my top desire to do that job, but I said that I would do that. And now I'm in the private sector.
So that is a lot of stuff for us to talk about on this podcast. So this podcast is really supposed to be about how the executive branch works. And everybody talks about how personnel is policy. And obviously, I think that is part and parcel about the policies and following the policies of the president. But I think it's also about a person who can execute on those policies. And you talked a little bit about serving 8 years at the UN and then eventually becoming ambassador. How did those years prepare you for one of the I think coolest jobs in the executive branch, being the ambassador? It certainly has a very cool title, but how did it prepare you for kind of the diplomatic mission of being an ambassador?
Well, certainly I saw for 8 years, I worked inside the Security Council. There are 15 members of the Security Council, and they rotate. 10 of them rotate every 2 years. And so what's really interesting is I got to see all sorts of styles of diplomats, right? There were so many foreign ministers that came through, heads of state, and ambassadors. So 193 countries, each having an ambassador, and I was there for 8 years. I saw hundreds of different diplomats, how they interacted with each other, how they made their arguments, how persuasive they were, how persuasive they weren't. How they were able to articulate the policy. Were they too detailed? Were they not detailed enough? And how they interacted with their staff and the media as a part of this. And so I really got to learn for 8 years what works and what a real good representative of your country looks like. And the lesson that I've learned is that out of 193 countries, there's 192 countries that do not apologize for pushing their own policies. It's one country that gets in trouble when we put ourselves first, and somehow we're called radical for putting ourselves first. But that's a crazy idea at the UN, because at the UN, everybody puts themselves first. I've been in tens of thousands of diplomatic meetings, and I've never been in a one that doesn't start and finish with the other country asking America for something. They want something from us. They articulate it. They're really good at zeroing in and saying, this is what I need. You need you to vote this way. I want this program. We need more money for this. They know how to ask. And so I learned that if you're going to represent your country and the taxpayers are paying you to represent your country, you better represent them. You don't represent elites. And you don't try to go there and be somebody that's trying to represent the country where you're going to. There's this whole concept at the State Department that if you're the U.S. ambassador to Germany, for instance, that you should be U.S., not Germany. You're not going there to do a travel log and to talk about how great Germany is. They have their own ambassador in Washington who is pushing how great Germany is and what people should be doing and thinking about Germany. It's our job as U.S. ambassadors to represent America and the American government and the American president and the American people. And so I was just really clear-eyed after working at the UN of what works. And I became that ambassador that really was unapologetically representing America. And I remember one time when many in the German media didn't like it. They didn't like having somebody who was so forceful and advocating for America, because they were used to people coming there and trying to say how great Germany was and how, wonderful the relationship was, and really glossing over some of the problems. And so when I became very forceful representing Germany, I remember this being an issue in the media and it coming up in one of Chancellor Merkel's cabinet meetings, where one cabinet official was complaining that, gee, that ambassador from America seems so strident. And the reaction from Chancellor Merkel was really interesting, that she ended up saying to the cabinet, this is what our ambassadors need to be like. We need to be much more forceful. He is just representing his country, and we need to be thankful that we know exactly what the Trump administration believes and is saying. There is no beating around the bush. She valued that. Now, ultimately, I'm not sure she valued every part of that, but I do know in cabinet meetings she pushed back.
I do see that as being something that would be very helpful, is just knowing a clear policy coming from the United States. Obviously, I think that goes back to having a president that is also very clear in what he wants, which I guess makes it easier for you to do your job. But generally, you mentioned taking on kind of the system. I see that in many ways. That could be not only the media, how Europeans view Americans, but also within the State Department. That's a different way of doing business from kind of decades of diplomacy.
Look, I'm not a fan of Washington, D.C. I don't like living there. I've always tried to live there as little as possible. I don't like to be a part of the system. The people there, I feel like, are very one-dimensional and not very friendly and not very trustworthy. So I've always chosen to live outside of Washington, even though I've been working for administrations and working in politics for more than 25 years. I value the reformers on the outside. And one thing that I will say is, I think the American people need to really understand that we're never going to get the Washington, D.C. types to reform themselves. It is just not going to happen. All of the people that live in Washington, D.C., the reporters, the lobbyists, the bureaucrats, politicians, they all want Washington, D.C. to be the greatest, best city. It's why they cheer for the sports teams in Washington and they wear Washington sports hats. And now we have generations of people who call themselves Washingtonians. It's a whole city unto itself. That was never the founders' concept. It was go to Washington and represent the rest of America and then go home and let someone else bring their skill set. That's the Jeffersonian principle of Washington, D.C. But we don't have that right now. We have people who live, work, go to church, go to school, and they're all in Washington. They want that city to be bigger and better. And it's never going to see an economic downturn because the people voting for budgets and more money and more programs all live in Washington, D.C. It would literally be like coming to Los Angeles, where I live, and coming from the outside and saying, here, I've got this great idea for all of you people in Los Angeles. Let's get rid of movies. And no one would do it. They would shoot you. they would crush you. And the reality is that we on the outside of Washington have to understand that Washington, D.C. is never going to reform itself. The only answer is to send people from the rest of America to Washington, D.C. who are committed to having their social life, their church, their family back home, not in Washington, D.C. And that's how we're going to bring the flavor of America and the values of America to our government. I view it very much like the Hunger Games.
It's a good analogy. I also live outside of DC, and I try to only go back very minimally when I'm asked to. I think I agree with you. I think it's also just having a good perspective of talking to people outside of DC about how their government is working. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that they're always shocked when you tell them stories about some of these things, because like you said, they believe that the government is kind of just seeking our best, and we're all kind of, going forward, seeking what's best for America. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, that's not always the case. Just to talk a little bit about your tenure as Director of National Intelligence, it is, as you mentioned, it was a short tenure, just taking that on at the request of the president. I think people don't really understand, obviously, because there's not a lot that is known about the intel community. But from what you can tell us, how is that really organized, and what's kind of like a day-to-day in the intel community?
Well, kind of pivoting off Washington, D.C., the system that doesn't always work. My first intelligence briefing was in 2001. I've had tens of thousands of briefings. It is I've seen raw intelligence from all sorts of different sources and on different issues. And I've been doing it since 2001. But when I was asked to be the acting director to come in while we found a replacement, the media immediately jumped on me and said he doesn't have any intel experience. To which my comment was, actually, I'm an expert on the consumption of the intel, which is the whole purpose of why we have intelligence. The whole reason we have intelligence is to inform our public policy officials of factual information that they may not have access to, so that we can make better public policy decisions. Intel exists for public policy officials. As the consumer for decades, felt like I was actually the perfect person to come in and reform for a couple of months. I could have had the job as D&I if I wanted it as a permanent job. But I didn't want that. And I said no. But I knew that the president needed a change. immediately and needed someone to come in a temporary fashion while they found a permanent. So I agreed to do that. And the Vacancies Act requires you, if you're going to be in an acting job, to be Senate confirmed in something. And so because I was Senate confirmed for U.S. Ambassador to Germany, I had to keep that U.S. Ambassador to Germany job while I was acting. So I technically was doing both. It was during COVID, so we were kind of all truncated, but I was doing both jobs. So I came into the D&I position really free to do the right thing. And on my first day, I was given by the team 5 or 6, I can't remember the exact number, 5 or 6 reports that the American taxpayer had paid for from outside groups like Ernst & Young and some consulting firms that had looked at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and they had come up with, outside groups, nonpartisan, had come up with some ideas of how to reform ODNI. Remember, the ODNI group was formed after 9/11 because our intelligence agencies weren't talking to each other. And so the bureaucrats in Washington said, hey, we have too many bureaucratic institutions not talking to each other, so why don't we create another bureaucratic institution? I think it was a dumb idea, but I was not a part of that. So it in theory was designed to be 200 people that was going to coordinate. They would coordinate between the interagencies. It behemouthed and blew up into 2,500, 3,000 people, and it became a competitive body to the intel agencies, not a coordinating body. And so these reports were pretty clear of trying to reform it. And on my first day, when I was handed these reports, and the career staff said, you should read these because this is the problems that we have, and these are the solutions that have been recommended by outside sources, I took them home. Over the next couple of days, I read them, and there was a theme to all of the different reports. There were the same things that they were saying are the problems. And so I started implementing those. Boy, did I hit a wasp nest in Washington, D.C., because Adam Schiff and all these crazy lefties came at me saying, why is this temporary political guy doing politics at ODNI? And I couldn't get real journalists to report the truth. And I kept saying, these aren't my ideas. These are the ideas that the American taxpayer has paid for time and time again. And no one in the positions before me had enough backbone to implement these. It took the temporary guy who didn't need to be confirmed, who didn't need the applause of Washington, D.C. to say, there's some really good ideas here that are not partisan. And so I began to make those changes. Another change that I made was there was an individual, who I'm not going to say his name, but there was an individual running one of the counterterrorism centers that everyone was complaining about. Everybody said he was terrible, and really the reports on him from his deputies and the people down the way were really terrible. And the career people asked me to get rid of him. And so I did. And I replaced this career guy who had terrible reviews and wasn't doing his job with a woman who was the number 3 person there, not the number 2, but the number 3, who everyone told me was really running the place and was really smart. And so before I replaced him, I called her in and I said, hey, you're getting great reviews. People love you. They think you've got great ideas. Do you want the top job? And she was like, oh, I'm like the number 3 person. I think I'm supposed to move up to 2 before I do that. And I was like, I don't know. Those are Washington rules. Those aren't my rules. And so I said, if you want the job, think about it and let me know. She came back to me the next day with I can't remember if it was 1 page or 2 page, but a memo that said, here are the things that I would do to change this place. This is what needs to be done. She was so thoughtful. She was so prepared. She just needed a little push. And so I gave her the job. And do you know what the media did? The media attacked me for firing the straight white guy and not promoting the woman. And I thought, here is an upside down world in Washington, D.C., where the gay OD&I leader just hired a woman, and somehow I'm getting hit because I went after the white guy. It was unbelievable, unbelievable. And yet it's so typical of Washington. I tell you that story because I've learned the lesson over time that you have to do the right thing, and you cannot care what the criticism is from the crowd, especially the crowd in Washington, D.C. I actually think that when the crowd in D.C. attacks you in a very strong way, it's because you're over the target. You know exactly what the problem is, and you're zeroing in on it, and they are threatened. So in many ways, if I'm being ignored by the media, I think it's probably because I'm a seat warmer and I'm not trying to reform the place. I can tell you, as someone who lives outside of Washington, D.C., who will never run for political office, I am somebody who believes that the American people are filled with common sense, and they want Washington, D.C. politicians to be filled with common sense. They don't want this gotcha style of not being thoughtful, of splicing one person's comments and pretending like it's the whole story. And I go to Washington, D.C., and I put on my hat to represent the American people, not to represent Republicans or Democrats or Californians, but to represent everybody to the best of my ability. And to me, that means bring common sense. Just think about what's good for the American people and be brave.
That, unfortunately, is a very hard, I think, thing to find in a lot of people.
Not if you had the upbringing that I did from my mother. If you were raised by my mother, you would know that is an easy thing to do. She's raised 4 kids, and they're all strong, and she demands that you do the right thing.
That's amazing. I just wanted to ask one more question. It's one that we ask all our guests on this show, and because a lot of people who want to listen to the show, who are listeners, are thinking about joining the executive branch. And so what would be your best advice for somebody who wanted to go into the diplomatic corps or into the intelligence community?
Look, I think the answer to every question in the world is always balance, is to try to make sure that you stay in a symbiotic, balanced state, right? So you don't go too far overboard on anything. And that's, I think, I'm a Christian, and that's part of the idea of Christianity is grace every morning, a restructuring, a resettling, trying to figure out what did I do wrong yesterday. And I love the concept of new mercies every morning. And I think I try to apply that to your career and to your life and to your friendships, is to seek balance. And so I think it's a long answer to say, I do believe that people should do public service. I think that you should get a job in Washington, D.C. with an administration that you believe in. But don't get trapped into one thing where you just do one thing your whole life. This ride that we call life is so cool and amazing, and you can do a zillion different things. So do it all. Try to go into business. Try to go into politics. Live life loud. And I came to that conclusion after I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma stage 4 in 2013. It was a terrible disease. I thought I was reaching the end of my life in 2013, and I beat it. And I beat cancer, and I'm a better person. I never want to go through it again, but I'm a better person because of it, because I live life with no regrets, and I try to look at all the different things in the world and say, I'd like to do that. I'd like to try that. Why can't I pursue that? So I'm not always successful at it, but I certainly am trying. And I think that people should do that. If you're sitting at home and you think it'd be cool to work in the intel community, go do it. You can do it. You can go work on a campaign. You can go apply. But, it's about who you know, network, be very aggressive about meeting different people. and you can do it and see if you like it. If you don't like it, go do something else.
Well, I think that is great advice. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure getting to know you better, getting to hear all of the amazing things that you worked on in both the Bush and the Trump admin. And hopefully we can have you back on sometime, because I think there's a lot to talk about.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. All the best.